Thomas Anderson stared at the ceiling of his modest apartment, watching the fan blade spin lazily above his bed. Another ordinary Tuesday night in Seattle was drawing to a close, or so he thought. The soft patter of rain against his windows provided a soothing backdrop to his thoughts about debugging code at work tomorrow. He was just drifting off to sleep when a subtle blue glow began to fill his bedroom. At first, he assumed it was headlights from a passing car, but the light intensified and took on an otherworldly quality. Thomas sat up, his heart racing as the glow coalesced into a humanoid form at the foot of his bed. He reached for his phone, but froze when the light dissipated, revealing a stunning woman unlike any he'd ever seen. Her skin had a subtle pearlescent sheen, and her hair seemed to float as if suspended in water, shifting between deep purple and midnight blue. Her eyes, though clearly alien with their vertical pupils, held an intelligence that immediately dispelled any notion that this was a dream or hallucination. "Greetings, Thomas Anderson," she said, her voice carrying an ethereal quality that seemed to resonate in his chest. "I am Valorian of the Stellar Confluence. I have chosen you." Thomas scrambled backward until he hit the headboard. "Chosen me? For what? How do you know my name?" The questions tumbled out as his mind raced to process what he was seeing. Valorian moved with liquid grace as she sat on the edge of his bed. "Your species has been under observation for some time. I have selected you as my potential mate based on extensive compatibility analysis." She spoke matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather rather than an interstellar proposition. "Mate?" Thomas's voice cracked. "Look, I'm flattered, but this is insane. You can't just appear in someone's bedroom and announce something like that." A small smile played across Valorian's iridescent lips. "I understand your confusion. My species enters a mating cycle once every 100 solar rotations. During this time, we must find compatible partners or risk genetic stagnation. Your psychological profile, genetic makeup, and emotional capacity make you an ideal candidate." Thomas ran a hand through his disheveled brown hair, trying to ground himself in reality. "Right. And of all the humans on Earth, you picked a software engineer who spends most of his time debugging other people's code?" "Your profession is irrelevant," Valorian said, moving closer. "It's your capacity for adaptation, your emotional intelligence, and your genetic compatibility that drew me to you." She reached out, her fingers emitting that same subtle blue glow as she touched his arm. A warm, tingling sensation spread through his body. What was that?" Thomas asked, surprised to find the touch pleasant rather than alarming. "A simple demonstration of my species' ability to interface with your nervous system. We can share emotions, memories, and sensations through direct neural contact." Valorian's eyes seemed to shimmer in the darkness. "I could show you more, if you're willing." Thomas found himself torn between fascination and fear. Here was proof of intelligent alien life, sitting on his bed, offering him something beyond his wildest dreams. But the rational part of his brain screamed that this was too sudden, too strange, too dangerous. "I need time to process this," he said finally. "You can't expect me to just agree to mate with an alien I just met, no matter how fascinating you are." Valorian nodded, seeming pleased rather than disappointed. "Your caution is one of the traits that made you suitable." "I have time, Thomas Anderson. My cycle lasts for what you would call 3 Earth months. But know this, I chose you not just for compatibility, but because in all my observations, you showed something rare among your kind, the ability to see beyond the surface, to accept the extraordinary, and to grow beyond your predetermined boundaries." As the night wore on, Thomas found himself engaged in the most surreal conversation of his life, learning about Valorian's world and trying to understand exactly what he'd been chosen for. With each passing hour, the impossible slowly began to feel like destiny. The morning sun filtered through Thomas's blinds as he made coffee, still trying to convince himself that last night hadn't been a dream. Valorian sat at his kitchen counter, examining a smartphone with intense curiosity. She had changed her appearance slightly to appear more human, her ethereal glow dimmed and her floating hair now falling in normal waves, but she was no less stunning. "Your species relies heavily on these devices for connection," she observed, scrolling through his social media feed. "Yet they seem to create as much isolation as they do communication." Thomas handed her a cup of coffee, which she sniffed with interest. "That's surprisingly insightful for someone who just learned about smartphones." He watched in amusement as she took a careful sip and her eyes widened at the taste. "My people value direct neural connection over technological interfaces," she explained, taking another sip. "This beverage, it creates a pleasant chemical reaction. Is this why humans gather in what you call coffee shops?" Thomas couldn't help but smile at her genuine curiosity. "Partly. It's also about the social aspect. Speaking of which, how are we going to handle this?" He gestured between them. "I can't exactly introduce you as my alien girlfriend at work." Valorian set down the coffee cup, her expression becoming serious. "Among my people, the mating process begins with a period of cultural immersion. We must learn each other's ways before any permanent bond can form. I've prepared a human identity that will withstand scrutiny. I'll be Violet Wells, a technical consultant from Norway." "Norway?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "My research suggested that humans are less likely to question cultural differences from Scandinavian countries," she replied with a slight smile. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Thomas froze, but Valorian remained calm. "It's your neighbor, Diane Patterson." She heard voices and is concerned. Before Thomas could ask how she knew that, he heard Diane's voice through the door. "Thomas? Is everything okay? I heard talking." He opened the door to find his elderly neighbor in her usual morning robe, looking concerned. Her eyes immediately fixed on Valorian, who had moved to stand beside him. "Oh. I didn't realize you had company," Diane said, her expression shifting from concern to poorly concealed interest. "This is Violet," Thomas said quickly. "She's a consultant I'm working with on a new project." "Charmed," Valorian said, her accent now carrying a subtle Norwegian lilt. "Thomas has been helping me understand American corporate culture." Diane's eyes narrowed slightly. "At 7 in the morning? International time zones," Thomas explained, perhaps too quickly. "You know how it is with global projects." After a few more minutes of awkward small talk, they managed to bid Diane goodbye. Thomas closed the door and leaned against it with a sigh. "That was close." "She suspects something," Valorian noted. "Not about my true nature, but she believes we are engaged in what humans call a romantic affair." Thomas felt his face heat up. "Well, technically. You're attracted to me," Valorian stated matter-of-factly. "Your physiological responses indicate sexual interest, yet you're conflicted because of my alien nature. This is normal and expected. Could you, maybe not analyze my physiological responses out loud?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, embarrassed but also intrigued. "How does this usually work on your world?" Valorian's expression softened. "Among my people, attraction begins in the mind. We share thoughts, memories, dreams. Physical intimacy comes later, after a deep mental connection is established." She stepped closer, her hand reaching for his. "Would you like me to show you?" Thomas hesitated only briefly before taking her hand. The moment their fingers touched, his mind exploded with colors and sensations he'd never experienced before. He saw fragments of her memories, crystal cities floating in purple skies, vast libraries of pure thought, the lonely journey through space that had brought her to Earth. When the connection broke, he stood there breathing heavily, overwhelmed by what he'd experienced. "That was incredible." "That was just a glimpse," Valorian said softly. "There is so much more to share, if you're willing to learn." As they spent the day together, Thomas found himself increasingly fascinated by her world and her perspective on his. She asked endless questions about human customs, emotions, and relationships, while sharing insights about her own culture that challenged everything he thought he knew about love and connection. But as evening approached, the weight of their situation began to sink in. This wasn't just about cultural exchange or even romance, there were larger implications he was only beginning to understand. And judging by the way Diane had been watching his apartment all day, their time of quiet exploration might be running out. A week had passed since Valorian's arrival, and Thomas was surprised by how quickly he'd adjusted to sharing his life with an alien. She'd proven to be a quick study of human behavior, though her occasional faux pas, like accidentally levitating coffee cups when excited or forgetting that humans couldn't communicate telepathically, kept him on his toes. But something was bothering him. Little inconsistencies in her story had begun to pile up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling him everything. It came to a head one evening when he returned from work to find her surrounded by floating holographic displays, hastily dismissed at his entrance. "We need to talk," she said before he could even set down his laptop bag. Her usual ethereal grace was tinged with tension. Thomas felt his stomach drop. That phrase doesn't sound any better coming from an alien, he attempted to joke, but his heart was racing. "What's going on, Valorian?" She stood, her form shimming slightly as her emotional control slipped. "I haven't been entirely truthful about my mission here." The air around them seemed to thicken with static electricity. "I am not simply seeking a mate for personal reasons. I am a diplomatic scout for my species, and our situation is far more dire than I initially revealed." Thomas sank into his couch, motioning for her to continue. The blue glow he'd first seen on the night of her arrival returned, filling the room with soft light as she projected images of her homeworld. "My people are dying," she said softly. "A genetic degradation has been spreading through our population for generations. We've tried everything to stop it: genetic engineering, artificial reproduction, even stasis preservation. Nothing has worked." The images shifted to show empty cities, abandoned nurseries, and laboratories filled with desperate researchers. "Our scientists discovered that human DNA contains something unique, a genetic resilience we lost millennia ago in our pursuit of physical and mental evolution. We need this to survive, but we cannot simply take it. The integration must be voluntary, mutual, and..." She paused, born of genuine emotional connection. Thomas's mind raced. "So when you said you chose me, your genetic profile is exceptionally compatible with our needs," she confirmed. "But that's not the only reason. The selection process also required finding humans capable of handling the truth, accepting difference, and..." She met his eyes, "capable of love that transcends species." "And if I agree? What happens then?" Valorian's expression softened. "Any children we have would carry the key to saving my species. They would be the first of a new generation, neither fully human nor fully of my kind. They would bridge our worlds." Before Thomas could respond, a high-pitched whine filled the air. Valorian's head snapped toward the window. "They've found me." "Who's found you?" Thomas moved to peek through the blinds. His blood ran cold at the sight of black SUVs pulling up outside his apartment building. "Your government has been detecting our energy signatures. They've been tracking unusual power fluctuations in the area." She moved with sudden urgency, her hands flying over invisible controls. "I'm not the only scout on Earth, but I may be the first they've located." "What do we do?" Thomas asked, surprised by how naturally he included himself in her situation. Valorian turned to him, her eyes glowing with an inner light. "That depends on you, Thomas. I can leave now, return to my people, and your life returns to normal. Or you come with me. But you need to understand, this isn't just about us anymore. You'd be part of something larger, a bridge between worlds, a chance to save an entire species." She held out her hand, that familiar blue glow emanating from her palm. But it must be your choice. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs outside made the decision suddenly very real and very urgent. Thomas looked at her outstretched hand, then at the door, where shadows were already visible beneath the crack. In that moment, all the sci-fi movies he'd ever watched flashed through his mind, but this wasn't a movie. This was real. This was about love, survival, and the kind of choice that changes not just one life, but potentially an entire civilization. The doorknob began to turn. Thomas Anderson. This is Agent Wilson with the Department of Special Operations. Open the door. The voice was authoritative, brooking no argument. Thomas looked at Valorian's outstretched hand, his heart pounding. In the span of a week, his world had expanded beyond anything he could have imagined. Now he had seconds to decide if he was ready to leave everything behind. I can't guarantee your safety if you come with me, Valorian said softly. But I can promise you wonders beyond imagination. The door shuddered under the impact of a battering ram. Thomas made his decision. He grabbed Valorian's hand. The world exploded into blue light just as the door burst open. Thomas felt a sensation like being pulled through liquid glass, and suddenly they were on the roof of his apartment building. The night air was cold against his face, and Seattle's lights sparkled below them like earthbound stars. We have about 3 minutes before they realize where we've gone, Valorian said, her hair now floating freely in its natural state. My ship is hidden in the Cascade Mountains. We need to reach it before they can establish a containment perimeter. Your ship? Thomas asked, still trying to process the fact that they'd just teleported. I thought you just appeared in my room that first night. A small smile played across her lips. That was a projected avatar. I needed to test your initial reaction before revealing too much. She pulled him close. Hold tight. This next jump is longer. The world shifted again, and Thomas found himself in a forest clearing. The air was thinner, they had to be at least a few thousand feet up. In the center of the clearing stood what looked like an abstract crystal sculpture, but as he watched, it seemed to unfold like a flower blooming in reverse, revealing its true form as a sleek spacecraft. Beautiful, isn't it? Valorian said proudly. It's a living ship, grown rather than built. It responds to my genetic signature and, she stopped suddenly, pushing Thomas behind a tree as a helicopter roared overhead, searchlights cutting through the darkness. They're tracking my energy signature, she said grimly. I'll need to power down all non-essential systems, which means no more teleporting. We'll have to reach the ship on foot. They began moving through the forest, trying to stay under the cover of the trees. Thomas was grateful for all those hiking trips he'd taken in his 20s, at least he wasn't completely out of his element. But as they crept closer to the ship, more helicopters appeared overhead, and he could hear vehicles approaching on the Forest Service roads. Valorian, he whispered as they paused behind a fallen log, if they catch us, what will they do to you? She met his eyes in the darkness. Best case scenario? They'll study me, try to learn my species' secrets. Worst case? They'll see us as a threat and react accordingly. She touched his face gently. You can still go back, Thomas. Tell them I kidnapped you. Your life could return to normal. He caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. Normal stopped being an option the moment you appeared in my bedroom. The warmth of her touch spread through him, and with it came fragments of her emotions, hope, fear, and something deeper, something that felt remarkably like love. A spotlight suddenly pinned them in its harsh glare. Don't move, a voice commanded over a loudspeaker. You are surrounded. Thomas looked at Valorian, saw the desperation in her eyes. The ship was so close, maybe 50 yards away. But between them and it stood a line of armed agents, their weapons trained on the pair. Trust me? Valorian asked, her voice barely a whisper. Completely, Thomas replied without hesitation. She smiled, and suddenly her form began to glow with an intensity that made the spotlight seem dim in comparison. The agents shielded their eyes, and in that moment of confusion, she made her move. But what happened next would change everything, not just for them, but for both their species. The light emanating from Valorian didn't just brighten, it transformed. It spread outward in pulsing waves, and Thomas felt a strange sensation, as if reality itself was bending around them. The armed agents stood frozen, their weapons still raised but useless against what was happening. "What you're seeing," Valorian's voice echoed in Thomas's mind, "is the true form of my people's power. We don't just travel through space, we dance with the fabric of reality itself." The light continued to expand, creating a dome of energy around them. Inside this bubble, time seemed to move differently. Thomas watched in amazement as the agent's movements became sluggish, almost static. But something was wrong. Valorian's form flickered, her breathing labored. "The containment field they've established, it's interfering with my abilities. I can't maintain this for long." Suddenly, a new voice cut through the chaos. "Stand down. Everyone, stand down." Through the shimming barrier of light, Thomas saw an older woman in a business suit striding forward, her badge held high. "I am Director Catherine Reynolds of the Extraterrestrial Contact Division. We've been waiting for this moment." Valorian's light dimmed slightly, but she maintained the protective field. "Waiting? We've known about your people's presence on Earth for months," Reynolds explained. "We've been monitoring, evaluating, trying to understand your intentions. What we've seen," she glanced at Thomas, "has been enlightening." Thomas felt Valorian's surprise through their connection. "You knew?" Reynolds nodded. "We've observed similar pairs across the globe. Humans and your kind, finding each other, forming bonds. We've seen enough to understand this isn't an invasion, it's salvation. For both our species." The director stepped closer to the energy field. "Your people need our genetic diversity to survive. But what you may not have realized is that humanity needs you too. Your advanced understanding of consciousness, your technology, your perspective on reality itself, these are things that could help us avoid our own extinction." Valorian's field flickered again, and Thomas steadied her. He could feel her exhaustion, but also her hope. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "An alliance," Reynolds said simply. "Official, open contact between our species. No more hiding, no more secret observations. We help you, you help us, and couples like you and Thomas show us the way forward." The energy field collapsed as Valorian's strength finally gave out. Thomas caught her, holding her close as agents rushed forward, not with weapons, but with medical equipment and scanning devices. "Your ship," Reynolds continued, "will help you conceal it properly, set up a secure location. You'll have protection, resources, and most importantly, freedom to continue your mission openly." Hours later, in a secure facility deep in the mountains, Thomas sat beside Valorian as she recovered her strength. The room they'd been given was comfortable, more like a hotel suite than a government facility. Through the window, he could see her ship, now safely housed in an enormous hangar. "Did you know," he asked, "about others like us?" Valorian shook her head. "I knew there were other scouts, but we operated independently to avoid detection. Or so we thought." She smiled wryly. "It seems humans are more perceptive than we realized. So what happens now?" Thomas took her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of their connection. "Now," she said, "we build bridges. Between worlds, between species, between hearts." She touched his face gently. "The question is, are you still willing to be part of this? It won't be easy. We'll be pioneers, facing challenges no one has faced before." Thomas leaned in, kissing her softly. Through their contact, he felt her surprise and joy. I made my choice back in that forest, he said. Whatever comes next, we face it together. 6 months later, Thomas stood beside Valorian in a crystal chamber aboard her ship, now permanently docked at the newly established Interspecies Relations Center. Below them, Seattle glittered in the sunset. They weren't alone, other couples like them had gathered, humans and aliens united in their mission to forge a new future. As Valorian's hand found his, Thomas felt the familiar surge of their mental connection, now stronger than ever. Through it, he could sense the life growing within her, their child, the first of a new generation that would bridge the gap between stars and species. Having second thoughts, she teased, sensing his contemplation. Thomas smiled, squeezing her hand. Only about how long it took me to say yes that first night. The sun set on Earth, but for Thomas and Valorian, it was just the beginning. Their love story had become part of something larger, a testament to the power of connection across the cosmos, and proof that sometimes, the greatest adventures start with an unexpected visitor in the night. The end.